Dr. Gautam Bhan, Dr. Ghazala Jamil, Dr. Nazima Parveen, Dr. Sohini Guha, Professor Sundar Sarukai, Professor Narendra Kumar, among others. Through our research methods lecture series and book discussion series, we try to bring to our audience and participants the opportunity to interact with experts from various social science disciplines with the objective of facilitating aspiring researchers in getting a better hold of contemporary debates in social sciences and equip themselves with a better variety of issues lying therein. Today we are here for our research methods lecture series on the state of exception doing field study in refugee camp. For this, we have two esteemed panelists with us, Dr. Rajarshi Dasgupta and Dr. Nasreen Chowdhory. I am pleased to welcome both of you. Rajarshi Dasgupta teaches Political Science, Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Formerly, he was the Fellow in Political Science at the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. He holds his DPhil in Political Science from Oxford University. He has awarded Felix Scholarship to pursue DPhil at Oxford University in 1997. He has authored several articles
Ganesh, you have become muted for some reason.
Okay. Initially, I have muted or just now?
Just now.
Okay.
For the last 2 minutes. But that's okay.
Okay. So, can you remind me what I have told actually?
That's okay. You were just introducing me.
Okay.
So that's fine. We go over, and if you have not introduced Professor...
No. Okay, I'm coming. Okay, no.
Nasreen,
yes.
You can introduce Professor Nasreen Chowdhory.
Dr. Rajarshi has authored several articles and book chapters, including The Ascetic Modality, a critique of communist self-asserting, The People in People's Art and People's War, the CPIM Machinery in West Bengal, Two Villages, Narratives from Coach Bihar and Malda, Framing Revolution, Marxism and Culture in Coast Bengal, Inventing Modernity in the Colony, the Marxist Discourse on the Bengal Renaissance in Contemporary India. And recently, he published an article entitled Geneva Camp, Dhaka, Bihari Refugee, State of Exception and Camouflage, from which the idea of today's West Bengal and the National Capital Region. And for the chair and discussion, we have Dr. Nasreen Chowdhory. Nasreen Chowdhory teaches political science at the University of Delhi. She holds her DPhil from McGill University, Canada. She has been awarded Commonwealth Scholarship, the UNHCR Fellowship, and others. She authored the book Deterritorialized Identity and Transborder Movement in South Asia, Refugees, Citizenship and Belonging in South Asia. She was a guest editor of special issues on displacement, a state of exception and beyond, issues and perspectives in forced migration in South Asia, in International Journal of Migration and Border Studies. Her article includes Displacement, a state of exception and beyond, introductory remarks in International Journal of Migration and Border Studies, Marginality and State of Exception in Camps in South Asia, International Journal of Migration and Border Studies, Marginalization and Exclusion, Politics of Non-Citizen Rights in Post-Colonial South Asia, Assessing Belonging and Claims of Home Among Refugees, a note on repatriation in South Asia. She is also a member of many research organizations like Refugee Research Network Canada, Mahanirban Calcutta Research Group, Calcutta, Executive Board Member, elected treasurer from 2011 to 14, International Association for the Study of Forced Migration, Board Member, Mahanirban Research Group 2015 to 16, Calcutta Research Group. So the format of today's talk would be like first in the beginning, Dr. Nasreen Chowdhory will speak about 5 minutes about the introductory remarks. and then Dr. Rajarshi Dasgupta will speak for around 30 to 40 minutes, and then again Dr. Nasreen Chowdhory will give her remarks for about 20 to 25 minutes, and at last we have question and answer session. So now, not taking too much time, I would like to invite Dr. Nasreen Chowdhory to proceed with this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Apologies for the delay. I have no idea. You have to let us in to talk, Ganesh. So that is how it works. So, and I know, refugee study is not something that anybody would like to let us in, right? Rajarshi, you would also agree with me on that one. But thank you so much for having me here. And I think it's a very, very important, subject at hand that we need to examine. So I don't want to stand between you and the speaker. So I would like to invite Professor Dasgupta to kind of have his talking points, and then we can, come in for, any of those discussions if when necessary. So over to you, Rajashita.
Well, thank you so much, Nasreen, and my thanks to the Speaking from Margin team and Ganesh for extending this invitation, and also for this great idea of having Nasreen as my discussant. The paper that we are talking about, the paper which led to this talk today, is a paper that has come out under as a collection, as part of a collection of other papers and articles, which is edited by actually Nasreen in a special issue of Journal of Borderland Studies. So she is in the best position to kind of actually talk about this paper for more than one reasons. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about how I have done my research, especially the methodological contours, broad lines of my methodology in doing the work that I did and that has been published recently on Geneva Camp, Dhaka, which is a particular case. So I'm going to talk about my research methods that I have deployed in carrying out that research. And then I'm not going to talk about the actual case, which is there in the paper, and which, we might kind of probably draw upon in the question answer session if required, but this is more like a discussion on methodology, and I'm happy to submit before you the methodological choices I have made, and I'm expecting that I'm going to learn from, what you have to say, and we can take together this argument maybe further ahead, enriched by your comments and remarks. So let me first of all state, though most of you would know, that there are many kinds of refugee camps. So there are transit camps, there are work camps, there are detention camps, there are permanent liability camps, and there are several kinds of refugee colonies which tend to, grow from originally these kind of camp formations and then become refugee neighborhoods in a city, sometimes in a town, sometimes in a cluster of villages, so on and so forth. And not all of these sites, not all of these camps would qualify or correspond with the state of exception. So I'm talking about, doing research in a particular kind of a case. We need to keep that in mind. And undoubtedly, there are extreme cases of marginalization, double sometimes, doubled by gender, tripled by question of caste and so on, as well as there are quite stable kind of refugee camps, which means that they have been there for several years, if not decades now, which are helped by both international aid economies as well as by national governmental attempts at rehabilitation and the process of gradual inclusion. So I'm talking about a particular empirical case, the Geneva Camp in Dhaka, which of course has its parallels. It's not the unique singular case, but which is also, not representative of all refugee camps as such. Here, the particularity lies in the fact that the existence of refugees is a life and death question nearly all the time for these refugees. If we want to kind of put this across simply, the refugees are highly exposed to the threat of death in one way or the other, besides experiencing massive dislocation and dispossession. Okay, so their everyday existence is an uncertain kind of a matter. They have to negotiate with the question of living nearly every day. Now, so there are, one might say, a special case within the larger refugee population, empirically speaking. Now that these people cannot claim right to property, they cannot claim right to livelihood, they cannot claim right to what we call right to the city, they cannot claim, an area that Nasreen has worked extensively on, the right to belong, but also they cannot really claim their right to life. And all these follows from the fact that they practically live in an exile from citizenship. They are outside the bonds of citizenship, the boundaries of citizenship. And in that sense, they form, one might say, the other of the citizen. If we know who the citizen is, then it is who is not the citizen that we are talking about, who's held outside, who's exiled, who's excluded from whoever is the citizen. So for these reasons of particularity, my methodology had to be changed quite a few times as I realized these dimensions of the particular case. In this case that I was looking into, I've been working on a couple of other refugee camps which are not exactly like this extreme. But as I realized the nuances and extremities and peculiarities of this case, I had to sometimes dramatically change the thrust of my methodology, trying to attack the case from different directions, trying to come to the theme from several different directions. So initially I started out as a standard kind of researcher would do, which is to treat the current state of the camp or site as my object of study, carrying out structured surveys based on structured kind of questionnaires and looking at household data, looking at the income, membership of the household, their access to important resources, so on and so forth. And this led me to then look at the available historical records, administrative documents, and whatever scholarship existed, whatever popular literature existed on this case. Now, after looking at these body of writings, I realized a big difference between the place of refugee, even as a theme, on the one hand in the records, in the documents and the public records, and on the other hand in the public discourses of Bangladesh, or what used to be East Pakistan. And I realized that in the case of refugees as such, I mean, from the lowest kind of rung of refugees to the refugees who have adjusted well and have become, important figures in the Bangladeshi society, there is a strange kind of tacit silence over the history of partition and the history of refugees, which is, quite in contrast to the case in India. In India, we have a lot of films on the refugees. We have a lot of literature, creative fiction on the refugees. We have a rich body of scholarship on the refugees and so on. But this is not the case with primarily Pakistan, but in particular with East Pakistan and what became Bangladesh. So I figured that narratives in general about the refugee experience and the refugee population were very few. And so one found it extremely hard to find the material with which one could flesh out, say, something like a social history of a particular population of literature, of refugees. Let alone, leave aside any focus on those that I attempted to study, which is a particular Urdu-speaking Muslim population, many of whom had migrated from South Bihar, but a number of them were also from what used to be the United Provinces, as well as certain other parts of the subcontinent. A whole lot of these Urdu-speaking Muslims had actually migrated to Bangladesh back in the 19th century when the railways were being laid late in that process. But, for convenience and with this othering that is there in their case, this entire population was referred to by Bangladeshis, by Bangla-speaking Muslims as Bihari, the Biharis. Though many of them, as I repeated, were actually not Biharis. Okay? And there were, I was extremely lucky that there were a couple of scholarly works on them, at least, giving us some initial background and some initial figures and data, including that of a historian who died prematurely, Papia Ghosh, who kind of pioneered the work on the partitions Biharis, which is the name of our work also. And apart from these scholarly works, I only came across a couple of documentary films by a radical filmmaker called Tanveer Mukammal. So apart from that, I found nearly no reference of this population in the at least popular discourse in Bangladesh. So after a point of time, I came to realize that what I was doing, which is, carrying out a structured kind of survey of a representative sample of households and conducting select interviews and focused discussion groups, these are not going to be enough. In fact, after my first encounter with the site, which was, back in 2004, 2005, I came away with the data, with the information that added up to a picture which was actually not very different from any average urban slum in any part of South Asia. It could be Karachi, it could be Islamabad, it could be Delhi, it could be any city and an urban slum of migrants. So I realized that I'm not being able to capture, or I had not been able to capture, some of the critical, peculiarities of this particular case, which I could sense, but I could not, let us say, quantify, or I could not, note down in the registers that I was using at that point. So this is when I started making methodological changes, and overall, all in all, I made three kind of methodological changes that required then, on my part, carrying out parallel streams of investigation, or parallel themes of research in different areas. The first of this was to try and understand what can be said as the long history, which is the intergenerational past of this refugee population in broad outlines, a history that went back far behind the establishment of this Geneva camp, the making of this camp, and also possibly could go behind the case of partition. So going behind 1947, in some cases tracking back to the 19th century. So to introduce a dimension of long kind of duration in the background of this population, and try to understand them over, let us say, 200 years at the very least. The second, is the second methodological change that I made was, I realized again after a certain point of time, and this was during my second kind of visit, which took place around 2011-12, so roughly a little more than 5 years removed from the first round of field work. I realized that, if I keep tracking the Bihari population and certain families and the history of chunks of this population, it is taking me to different kind of geographies. It is taking me to different kind of areas, the different areas from which different segments of this population had eventually come in during and they had gathered together during the Bangladesh war, basically. They were gathered together from different parts of Bangladesh where they were settled, and some of them were major railway junction cities or towns like Ishordi or like Sayyidpur. These are, other kind of hubs of Bihari migrant kind of refugee population. So what I did is that I took a decision to trace the history of the space, the site, Mohammadpur, where the camp was located. And I started to trace a spatial history, the history of that topography, that terrain that became Mohammadpur, Now, going back to the early Mughal period, broadly kind of looking at the topographic pattern of that area, which used to be the borders of Mughal Dhaka, and then subsequently plot the transformations of that space with the neighborhoods growing up in that area. In the background was the larger urbanization of Dhaka as it took place, in which Mohammadpur was, I came to discover, was a kind of peripheral location at the borders, and which was basically wetlands or kind of marshy lands with large kind of river bodies with not so much of landlocked area at all, but which started to getting filled up as I realized in the early East Pakistan regime. Now, looking at this history for tracking what is happening to this landmass, to this area, locality, in the immediate past decades, let's say from the early 2000 to the current period, I took help from Google Earth, so I went somewhat eclectic. I didn't keep to the typical methodological, devices of political science. I took help from a lot of help from geography, physical geography. So I started kind of households within this camp in Midpur and somewhere outside these locations altogether. I decided, and this is the way I realized it, that without this deep dive into the history of one kind of family and its extended kind of membership, it will not be possible for me to understand the impact of the different changes that took place over time on this larger population, and which have been taking place for at least 70 years or so. And you cannot track an entire population at that level, what has been happening to them for a span of 70 years or 80 years or 100 years. It's somewhat impossible. So, but you could do this in the case of one family, in fact, one extended family, which would be constituted by 2 or 3 households and so on. So this was the third kind of methodological revision that I did. And once again, this is kind of taking liberty with methods taught in political science. What I wanted to do was, by and large, I mean, if you ask me what was I kind of trying to focus on by all these kind of different methodological tools and approaches, is that I was trying to capture a nuanced and detailed sense of the precariousness of this population, the risks, that they had to deal with every day, the obstacles that they had to face, on significant events, and, the difficulties, troubles, and travails of this population, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, what kind of resources did they rely upon, if anything, in order to negotiate with these threats, with these risks, with these, terrible troubles and difficulties that they had to face every day. So when I adapted this third kind of methodological revision, the ultimate result of putting all these, various different mixed kind of methods together is that I found myself doing, to a certain extent, the ethnography of a site over a fairly long time. So I've been working on that site for nearly 10 years by then, and I was trying to dig up a history going back 100 years or more. In some cases, going back to the Mughal period. My field visits were, as I said, spread into 3 rounds, 5 years apart, covering altogether 10 years. So right at the beginning of the 10 years, I made the first field visit. In the middle, after 5 years, I paid the second round of visit, and then I paid another substantial visit by the end of the 10 years. Okay, and every time it was 2 to 3 months of kind of work. So my approach, I realized by this time, had become somewhat similar to, as you might have guessed by now, anthropologists, really. With, of course, one crucial difference which I wanted to retain. And there's something here which I mean, there were a lot of things here that I was approaching like an anthropologist, but I had a certain sense of priority about the, at least, organization of the material that I was investigating, that anthropologists may or may not share. That is not within, their kind of intellectual remit. this is preference is that I wanted to collect and organize the different materials, through these different approaches in a manner so that we can directly grasp and see the political dimension in this entire aspect. Now, I proceeded to frame this political dimension as two sides of what can be called biopolitics, a politics that concerns life directly. On one side, I tried to kind of catalog and make an inventory of the various administrative steps, of the various kinds of social events, historical events that made ultimately a life of dignity virtually impossible for this population, and which therefore left this population with what one could borrow from the philosopher Agamben and call bare life. Okay, it's a conception that Agamben has, a very, very powerful conception that I borrowed. At the same time, I was also looking at and looking for the elements and traces of a counter practice on the part of the population, a kind of practice that the population did while facing these kind of obstacles, a set of ways through which the refugees can be seen as dealing with these obstacles and also escaping from the broad legal, social disapproval of them as a population, and their devaluation as human beings, the devaluation of their life. So this is what I found as the other side of biopolitics. That has a resistance that is offered by life itself. On the one hand, there is the kind of biopolitics that constantly threats the life of these population, and on the other side, there is a biopolitical angle in the kind of coping strategies or maneuvers that life offers as a resistance to the threats on life, that side of biopolitics. Now, let me add that in trying to bring up this dimension of counter practices or trying to bring up traces of what can be seen as the politics of these kind of refugees, I was making a departure from Agamben. Agamben does not make provision for these kind of practices in the case of what he calls bare life. I mean, for him, it is bare life precisely because it is stripped of politics. Okay, but I was here, trying to generate a sense of some kind of politics, and which could be called, which could be seen in the lens of something like the available ideas of subaltern resistance of various kind. But here I decided to stop short of calling this practice on the part of the refugees as resistance, because I also wanted to distance this observation from narratives that try to kind of talk about, like there is the narrative of a fairly well-known scholar, Victoria Redcliffe, who had come out with a book on this Geneva camp and the Bihari refugees, where she talks about acts of citizenship as resistance. So that is another kind of narrative that is given. But I thought that it's better to see these acts not so much as resistance, but to kind of make a more modest sort of proposition. And that modest proposition on my part was calling them, instead of acts of resistance, instead of politics of resistance, what I decided to call, this is not there in the paper fully articulated, but what I've thereafter decided to articulate as a politics of persistence, a politics that is concerned with, simply persisting in the face of oppression, simply going on living in the face of oppression, which can be seen as resistance. But I think to call it politics of persistence, gives it a different kind of valency and significance, which we can, discuss if you like more. Yeah, so I think that's, have I kept to the time, Ganesh?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so that was, what I had to talk about. Now over to you and Nasreen for critical comments and questions.
Do you want me to come in now, Ganesh?
Yes, yes. First
Okay.
we will.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rashida. It's always a delight to kind of, not only to find somebody who's working on an area which has been unfortunately very understudied in a very different way, especially under enforced migration studies. So I am personally, I must say, very appreciative.
Nasreen, just speak a little closer to the computer because a bit of your sentence is getting muffled. The tail of your sentence. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's okay. Oops. Do I
Yeah,
need
we
to-
can hear your oops, which means now it's working well.
Okay. All right. So what I'm again, as I was saying, that I'm very appreciative of the fact that as South Asian scholars, that when we work on a subject which has been very very understudied, it's very very typically accepted, and it should be somewhere we need to have this conversation, continuing this conversation. Having said that, before I kind of raise some intervention or questions.
Nasreen, again, just please come a little close to the microphone. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm very anxious to listen to it, whatever you have to say. So I'm bugging you again and again. Sorry.
No, I'm just wondering, is it my computer?
Yeah, this is fine now.
Oh, this is okay. You want me to speak here? Okay. Yeah. So what I was trying to get at was, first I want to give a bit of a genealogy on the camp itself, because when we talk about camps, there is a kind of an idea about where did the idea of camp emerge from. So various kinds of work has been done, and what we kind of have attempted to do in a lot of our own work is to give a critical genealogy of the camp and how does the idea of camp really emerge. So historically, if you were to look at it, that camps actually emerged not only post World War I and II, but somewhere it is a phenomena where the whole idea was to segregate the population and kind of keep them away from the citizens, so to speak. So we cannot therefore ignore the whole constructed idea of what is a refugee camp. And this genealogy actually helps us understand from the idea of concentration camp, internment camp, to the camp that is prevailing in post-World War II scenario, where refugees did, when they began to come in, the host population had to kind of reckon to, safeguard them, provide for them, but at the same time segregate them. So there's a politics of that which is very, very critical when we talk about, encampment of refugees. And somewhere what I think we will agree that all of us have been attempting to figure out how does that really emerge in the context of South Asia. Because South Asia has a very unique sense of encampment of refugee, and there has been distinctive refugee population that have been encamped, starting with the partition refugees. And all the refugee colonies that really emerged were actually where there were camps, starting from 47 and then 1971, both. So somewhere we can see that the idea of a city is emerging from that particular space or speciality. And that is critical for us to understand and to engage, because somewhere refugee camp does not remain a space where they just live, but it's a camp where it grows with them, with the refugees, with the family, and over a period of time, which can be expanded into a city, may or may not, depending on the location, which kind of refugees we're looking at. So I think that's very important to bring in the South Asian dimension of what we mean by refugee camps. And that aspect is something that we often, gloss it over, or we kind of take it for granted. Because definitely from concentration camp to internment to the camp that exists today, there's a huge difference. And the difference is that, as Agir would say, this is where the undesirables or the outcasts or the pariahs or who do not have a space tend to live. So that aspect is very important. What I'm really appreciative, Rashida, is the way you went about in terms of your, engaging with the refugee subjectivity, especially in the Bihari population in Mamadpur, and the topographical intervention that you did, because that is something very different than what I have really read so far, and I think Victoria also doesn't do it, because to follow one particular family over a period of time also allows us to negotiate the idea of camp through the experiences of the refugee subjectivity and through speciality. Meaning how the space itself is kind of existing, because that's a space where refugees actually assume to call it a home or a place where they belong. So somewhere I think what I was very curious about is, yes, dispossession exists. There is an idea that there is an everyday nature of dispossession, and this dispossession is not about this materiality dispossession. It's about loss of dignity. It's about loss of self. So in other words, what we can say, that can we therefore say that what is a refugee camp? Because these days, anybody who is displaced, be it a citizen or a non-citizen, it becomes a camp. So somewhere I would like to have an engagement, not maybe in this, but somewhere all of us, to not overuse a term which necessarily has been associated with those who are dispossessed. So there are varied understanding of dispossession with speciality and dispossession with different kinds of population. That's one. Second is South Asia region offers a very unique case. So that uniqueness perhaps needs to be showcased much more strongly for all of us. And so because somewhere it gets lost in this translation, that we keep doing of various kind of work that we're doing. With the empirical knowledge that is emerging, we're kind of underestimating the idea of speciality that has emerged in the context of South Asia. And if you want to talk about it in the context of partition, yes, that is there too. But now the way we see the Afghan refugees, and more specifically now the Rohingya refugees, if you want to put it that way. So that's the second aspect. Third, I found it very interesting because you were talking about, politics of persistence. My question would be then, refugees have no other idea but to persist, because that's all they have, because they have no other place to go to. So that's my question is, how is this any different? Let's say, would it be any different than belonging? Because the idea is they fail to be accepted even as a refugee / non-citizen, then they have no other choice but to persevere. So this is where I think Agamben comes in very, very handy. So the state of exception that the way he talked about is obviously not in the South Asian context. So what we have done is, we as scholars, we have heavily kind of borrowed from his work and tried to see if that can be engaged through the lens of South Asia. Well, South Asian realities are different, will be different because of the nature of the politics itself and the state formation, state building that really went on post, especially in the post-colonial state formation that happened. So somewhere all those uniqueness really is something that's very critical. So how does Agamben come handy to us is, somewhere we are engaging with the idea that yes, it is state of exception, but this state of exception is a varied nature of state of exception. So it's not about one community feeling that they are disconnected with the sovereign and hence they are going more than their life. That's true. But somewhere I think that it's critical for us to move beyond Agamben and actually critically engage with Agamben, because Agamben himself would like to be challenged at this point. Because South Asia throws these diverse experiences which can challenge this notion to say that refugees who are living in these spaces are indeed somewhat active citizen or active non-citizen, because their everyday activity empowers them to continue to live as a refugee. So whether in the case of the Biharis or the Rohingyas, see what is interesting is the Rohingya refugees are now engaging with something called, they have a cell phone. They have, they are not mattering as individual, but their existence matter because now they can be seen as one of the, unit in, let's say, in Twitter. So they are engaging in the world of, biometric, and they are being counted as one voice. So the question is, where is it that we can place the refugee colony here, because today we don't want to talk about refugee camps anymore. We want to talk about, because most of these colonies have become cities and have become like semi-cities. And if you look at the history of, let's say, Delhi, right? And some of the areas which used to be where refugees were housed were extended, and they've now become where certain communities are residing, because that's how it became extended. So somewhere geographers are very easily navigating this, because they realize this is how city is being made and constructed. But this is again very uncharted territory. So if it is uncharted territory, then somewhere the mapping is not really happening very well. So is it easy for city formation to emerge from a refugee colony in the South Asian context then? Or is it something that we are kind of presuming it's a very natural, accepted, phenomenon? And my final point was, in the case of this particular family that you were following, and since you mentioned intergenerational, narrative, were there any stories of, let's say, empowerment, disempowerment within the generational shift? Especially, let's say, if you were seeing the in terms of the stories that were there. Because those who came at an earlier stage would definitely feel that they did not belong. But today, their story is very, very different. Or is it different? We don't know. So that's something that I would like you to kind of, if you have a little bit of time, to bring that aspect in. And my, again, final would be, were you able to get into the gender question? Especially, the women, the voices of women. And whether they're, in the kind of methodology that you adopted, which is actually fascinating. And that's something I really, again, I'm very grateful that you were able to do that, because that's a very good, contribution to the field itself. So if you could kind of bring some of these aspects in, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Nasreen, for fantastic comments and questions as always. So what does, Ganesh, should I be responding to Professor Chowdhory, or will take questions and then?
You can respond first, Nasreen, and then we can take questions from audience.
Okay, so I'll do that. So let me go the other way, in reverse order, the questions and points and concerns that you have flagged, Nasreen. All of them are fantastic. You're hitting the nail on the head. Probably because, you've been working so long in this area. You're among the, I would say, the first segment of scholars who's beginning to take this study of refugees and camps to a different kind of dimension and depth. So, no, unfortunately, to begin with, I could not really look so much at the gender question. There are 2 or 3 reasons for that. One reason is that in the first place, it was very difficult for me to get even the men folks speaking to me, because they are identified as Urdu speaking Bihari Muslims, and there was no way in which I could hide my identity, which probably I shouldn't have either, as a Bengali Hindu man coming from West Bengal. So I am already part of a suspect kind of majority in their eyes to begin with. And I could therefore get households in the sense that I could enter the household and I could sit in their bedroom, or I could sit in the, living space, and I could talk to the family members that way. I couldn't do that beyond 5-6 households, because the men would come outside and they would talk to me standing outside, and they wouldn't really kind of entertain my prospects of going inside and talking to the women. And the few women who I talked to, as I kind of mentioned in the paper, they were very, very decided and very reluctant to, kind of actually give me the real information about themselves, about their background, about the household. They were extremely cynical and defensive, On the one hand, cynical because they've been living this life for 70 years and they must have seen research in people like me come and go so many times, but it has done nothing for them. And that the usual question that we face when we go to work in these kind of areas, that what are we going to get out of this? So they were simply, and there was just too much of work that they had to be doing all the time. Okay, so even if men could talk to me while they were doing karchupi, many of them were Ansaris, as I described. So they would be doing that, as a reflexive thing, and they would be talking to me at the same time. But the women, the kind of work they would do, they wouldn't really care. I wish I had a female kind of research assistant. Then it would have become far more easier to kind of get into the homosocial sphere of women, because men and women in these contexts actually socialize separate. It's very difficult to find them in mixed kind of environment. So with a lot of regret, I had to, kind of let that go, probing into the gender question. I really wish that somebody would do that. Um, Intergenerational narrative. Yes, I mean, this is really important for me because that is partly what is so unique about these Urdu speaking Muslims, that they were actually, I mean, historically, when we look at it, in the 40s, they were actually very reluctant to those segments that were living in South Bihar. They were very reluctant and recalcitrant. They did not want to migrate to East Pakistan. Okay, so they even kind of submitted a deputation to the Muslim League leadership, saying that they considered the places, their ancestral places, themselves as Pak, as sacred land, and therefore they don't want to be moved to a different kind of geography. But the Muslim League leaders prevailed, Jinnah prevailed, and they migrated. Now, uh, when they migrated, interestingly, the first 2 decades, when the country was part of East Pakistan, they had Urdu-speaking Muslim West Pakistani elite who were running the important institutions, the governmental institutions and other important institutions. So, which made this elite actually prefer or privilege these Urdu-speaking Muslims over the local Bengali-speaking Muslims. Okay? So that created a lasting rift. So right after they went over, this population actually prospered. They had, a kind of significant jump in terms of their earning, in terms of their living. Many of them actually became house owners in Muhammadpur and other areas around Muhammadpur like Mirpur and so on. So they were doing extremely well and far better than let's just say the local kind of Muslim population, the local Bangla speaking Muslim population. So this is the seed of an old kind of distrust between them. Now, so come Bangladesh war, when the language movement was carrying on, it is natural, that most of this population actually went over to supporting the Pakistani regime. And many of them joined the Razakar army and were prepared to fight battles for the Pakistani regime against the Mukti Jodha, against the kind of soldiers of liberation war. And this made them later into kind of enemies of the new Bangladeshi nation, which therefore meant that when Bangladesh came to be established, these people were stripped of their properties, they were stripped of their possessions, they were, from wherever they had settled, and had been actually massacred in various kind of clashes. So the surviving lot managed to persuade the International Red Cross Society to kind of put them together in this camp-like formation, and which is why it is called Geneva Camp, referring to the International Red Cross. So it's very interesting. So they prospered right after they went, and then that was immediately followed by a spate of dispossession, severe dispossession and dislocation, and then kind of sinking further below, being kind of trapped into this camp, which does not show any sign of social mobility. It's like living in an exile or outside, almost as it's outside Bangladesh, this kind of space. That's what the intergenerational narrative reveals, apart from other very interesting issues which I pointed out in the paper. Like, it seems like the earlier generations, for instance, and this also indicates the practice of many people before the partition to actually travel widely across the subcontinent. Uh, as the railways began to be laid out, there is a generation or two which traveled very widely and established connections and linkages with people living in, Karachi, Islamabad, Hyderabad, Bihar Sharif, and then here on this part, parts of Assam, Narsingdi and Mymensingh, and so there were people who were traveling across, especially traders, and a large lot of these generation of Urdu-speaking Muslim people were traders. So they traveled widely, which means that they gathered a huge amount of social capital, a huge amount of trust through this network, which would also became instrumental in kind of facilitating their journeys abroad to parts of Middle East at times, in search of livelihoods. Now, this forms a very important part of the resources that the residents of the camp can use to cope with the exclusion, to kind of respond to the exclusion, to negotiate with the operation there. These kind of ties, and subsequent generations of Bihari Muslims constantly kind of travel under pseudonyms, pretending to be others. What I call camouflage in the paper. So they kind of pretend to be others. They pretend many of them have forged documents and passports and photo ID cards in other kind of local addresses, and they use this to try and keep these connections alive. So that's the kind of fascinating aspect that I found. On the one hand, kind of real, a kind of life which we cannot really imagine, where travel and traveling wide across the subcontinent is very much part of one's usual routine. And the other thing is that this network becoming a very important resource for them when they become extremely marginalized later on, and their struggles to kind of keep this network going, this mobility, the capital of mobility, as probably Joya Chatterjee would call it. You asked a absolutely brilliant question in asking how cities are made. So yes, I think we are still to realize the implications of a whole lot of urban studies stuff that is done, and that is done on South Asia, is yet to kind of realize that a huge part, a significantly major part of post-colonial urbanization is actually, it intersects with refugee histories, with the history of refugee settlements, of refugee neighborhoods, of refugee camps and colonies. It is yet to realize this. And I must admit that I became aware of it when, there was a project that I was doing before I wrote this paper, which is a project that is done now, but where I was collaborating with this geographer and anthropologist on urbanization. And we, after our study, which was done in several cities, some 5-6 cities across South Asia, so looking at Bangladesh, looking at several cities in India, Pakistan, Nepal, and so on, we found that one cannot understand the transactions of land in a city, the buying and selling of land in a city, the laboring population in the city, the kind of infrastructural growth in the city, without taking villages into account, without taking rural to urban kind of migration into account. So for a long time, I think for the most part, even now, most urban studies or urbanists usually completely overlook or ignore the villages and kind of neglect the migrants and the elements of migration that are there, because the city for them is precisely what is not the village. But so much of the city in the case of South Asia and post-colonial South Asia is actually constituted by the population, the mores, the customs, the traditions, the practices that are actually coming in from the villages. That itself, I think, is a fascinating kind of question to research on. I live in JNU, which is based on land that was taken away, that was acquisition by the DDA in the 1970s from the villagers of Monirka. And so, one of my students who has worked in this direction, she eventually found that, for instance, much of the Monirka area, right from the MLA to MP to resident welfare associations to traders and businessmen associations, are controlled by one clan, the Tokas clan. The Tokas clan actually control centers in, and this is not a peculiarly urban phenomena. You cannot have a clan controlling, 4 or 5 units of neighborhood, unless you're looking at mafias, so to speak. But this works at a very different level because, and Monirka, as we know, there persists structures of villages within Monirka, around which there are, cities and urbanization. So I think you have really kind of hit the nail on the head when you brought this question of urbanization and refugees together, migration, refugees together. I think a lot of interesting work can be done in this regard. Um, So the uniqueness of South Asia and how do you engage with Agamben? I'm not attempting to, answer all your questions exhaustively because some are, I realize, kind of feedback for thinking more. And I hope to be in this conversation with you and for, years ahead. But the way I thought that I'm looking at this is I'm borrowing from Agamben, without any doubt, this conception of camp, this conception of state of exception, and this idea of bare life that I'm talking about, Bihari Muslim refugees live. Okay. But in Agamben, and because precisely Agamben is borrowing from the concentration camp, he is borrowing from the experience of the post-World War or interwar kind of camps, it leads him to a formulation where you have bare life and then you have the final solution. You have the extermination of the refugees, of the gypsies, of the Jews, so on and so forth. Because the Nazi historical experience is capital to him, is kind of central to his imagination of what takes place in camp life, Auschwitz and so on. And therefore he cannot imagine, or he does not make a space for any kind of politics, within this period. And this point has been raised by, a few other scholars, to my mind, working on other contexts who have talked very strongly about there being elements of resistance that Agamben's model overlooks. Now, so that is a kind of, I use that kind of interval between bare life and death to speak about certain kind of practices. Now, to my mind, the empirical nature of these practices, like camouflage that I've tried to theorize, these practices, to my mind, are not sufficient to be called resistance. And there lies another kind of uniqueness of the South Asian experience, because I don't see a challenging of the authorities or a transgression, a transparent kind of transgression of the rules set in place by the government, or a challenging or critical questioning of the society around one. I see attempts of making one's own life flexible so that one can slip through the gaps of these rules, of these societal disapproval, and so on and so forth, right? So I find a kind of activity which I have tried to kind of call as persistence, which is basically a politics that allows one to live. And that appealed to me also because, of course, when one makes an argument, I'm not only making this argument, yes, the case of Bihari Muslim Urdu-speaking refugees is the immediate instance of this argument. But I believe that there is a possibility of generalization of this argument. In the case of, minor populations, as at large. And what we are looking at in the age of this authoritarian population, from the perspective of a large number of, these threatened kind of outsiders or others, beginning with Muslim Urdu-speaking refugees in Bangladesh to, Rohingyas to a whole lot of other populations who we are declaring to be non-citizens every day through the different kind of administrative measures. I see fundamentally a struggle to persist, which has not quite taken on the momentum of resistance as yet. So I think it's productive to mine this, to dig this line of thinking about, how does one persist before one, goes on to kind of talk about it as resistance. I'm very tempted with the James Scott kind of theorization and thinking of this itself as resistance, but there's a part of me which is very skeptic, which, wants to kind of keep in a certain measure of the bleakness, of the hopelessness, of the desperation of the people who are doing this constantly. They don't look to me, to be living with the realization that they are being able to resist, either the state or the majoritarian society and so on. Which is why I thought that coming up with this argument is a way of talking back to Agamben and talking back to the historical context that Agamben is borrowing from and its generalization, let's say in the global north, to kind of put it in a nutshell, that this is something that probably can be found much more in the global south, and certainly in the case of South Asia, we can see this kind of politics among the outsiders, among the refugees, among the non-citizens, the doubtful citizens, so on and so forth. The different ways of coping, negotiating, and surviving. Fundamentally surviving. That's what I was trying to focus in on. So yeah, for now, that's all that I can think of as response to your fantastic questions. But we'll keep this going if you're okay with that. Yes, Ganesh.
Yeah. So now his floor is open for the questions. Anyone ask questions, then you can raise your hand. Then we can take the questions one by one. Yeah, Suman Talukdar. Yes, go ahead.
Hello, sir.
Hello.
I was one of your students in CPS, and it's a delight hearing back from you after so long. We used to wait for your class every Tuesday and Thursday at 2:00 just to hear you speak about Marx and aesthetics. So coming back to it's not just a question, but also something that crossed my mind when you were speaking about how people in the camp experienced the space they inhabited. So drawing from that, I wanted to ask how have you traced, or whether you have traced, a question of identity that they see themselves as? I mean, what kind of identities do they create for themselves and co-create, not only with the space they inhabit, but also with the people they share it with? Is that something you've also looked at, and how have you constructed such dimensions to your work? That is something. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad for the question. Yeah.
Can we take one more question?
Yeah.
Yes.
We could collect a few questions and then.
Sikha, go ahead.
Yeah. A very good evening to everyone. This is Shikha. So actually, I have been working on this question is not related to your topic, sir, but I have a doubt about the methodological part, because I have been working on witch hunting practices in Assam. So in that particular village where I am working, there is a segregation that has been made. Like people, those who have been branded as witch, they have started to live in a separate, space of the village, which is, not close to the village, which is, close to the forest. So, so when you are talking about the refugee camp and the methodology, in the last visit of my fieldwork, I have not gone to the camp, like the village where they have started, now they started to leave. But in the next visit, so I am planning to actually, visit or, talk to those people. So, so I was just thinking how, it can be, contextualized with regard to, South Asian context of, not exactly refugee camp, but construction of a camp, like, or can it be called as a refugee camp also, like, so yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Lovely question. Anybody else? Alok Ranjan.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the presentation. I'm hearing you speak on this paper for the second time, and my question is more general, and it actually relates to the conceptual part of it, and it is, do you think that it is the problem of our too much engagement with the idea of the state and its total effects on populations that we study, because that will maybe explain the problem that you are also tackling with, that we tend to translate all the activities that the populations are doing as sort of resistances, right? So do you think that we fail to register those activities in their own terms for what they are, because we are already all the time looking at the total effect of the state?
Okay, thank you. Great question again. So should I respond to those three questions, Ganesh? How do we go about this?
Yeah, we can. Then
Okay.
somebody else. So you can take
Anand
that.
Raj.
Yeah.
Let's have Anand Raj's question. Anand Raj, you could please unmute yourself and ask the question. Or has he accidentally raised the hand? Do you have a question, Anand Raj? In that case, you can turn on the microphone and ask the question. Nothing is forthcoming from Anand Raj, so I take it that it's probably an accident, or he could come in later if he can figure out, the technical thing if he has a question. So let me start this time, in the order of the questions, in the order in which the questions were asked. So, Suman, yes, much of my work actually, the core theoretical query of my work has to do with identities. In the sense that, as I said, that one of the big tragedies with this population is that they are Urdu-speaking Muslims. In fact, they are not even that, because their grandfathers or grandmothers were actually Urdu-speaking population who served the Pakistani elite. Thereafter, once Bangladesh was created, they have had two different generations who have a working knowledge of Urdu and who probably speak in Urdu at times in their homes, at their homes or in their domestic situation, but who are much more fluent and Bangla speaking kind of people in all practical purposes. So they don't want to see themselves as Urdu speakers, number one. Number two, they obviously don't want to see themselves as Biharis, because in the first place, they are coming from different parts of the country, including Bihar. Some of them were already located in various parts of what became East Pakistan. So, it's a factual kind of violation in their case. For people who have nothing to do with Bihar, for them to be addressed as Bihari or clubbed together as Bihari. And we know that the appellation Bihari has something like a negative connotation. It is almost like an ethnic name for a universal working class in the South Asian context. And apart from other things, this is the kind of stigma that the word Bihari carries in many kind of contexts. So yes, they are unhappy about that identity too. The identity that they want to practically claim is that of a Bangladeshi, okay, that of being a local, that of somebody who belongs. And this is the identity that is not allowed for them to have, for them to own up to. The rest of the host society is terribly hostile, is very strongly opposed to their claiming themselves as Bangladeshis or Bangalis or kind of local people, and which is precisely what I try to talk about as the politics of persistence, that in the sense in which these people, therefore, especially the younger generation, the moment they're outside the camp, the moment they step outside the camp, they try to lose all the kind of visual markers or other kinds of markers that they have, which identifies them with being Urdu speaking or being from the camp. And they try to pass themselves off as local Bengali population in other parts of Dhaka. And if they can successfully pull that off, then they manage to access, on a higher kind of rungs of society, employment, so on and so forth. So this is what I try to call as camouflage, that they have to always kind of disguise themselves in some sense, in terms of who the host population sees them as, and they have to pass themselves off as more or less part of the host population. They have to constantly play this game, and this is the game that they sort of play, not in the sense of it really being a sport, but it's a kind of maneuver that they do, and which gives them some kind of space to find a job, to find a livelihood, to maybe have a few friends outside the camp, to have some kind of a recognition and acceptance, in the immediate neighborhood or society and so on. But as soon as it transpires, as soon as it comes out that they belong to the camp, or that they belong to the originally Urdu speaking population, they are shunned. They are immediately called out as traitors to the nation, and they face a range of hostilities which could also involve simply getting lynched. So that's the bit with identity. The key to their politics of persistence is a kind of playing on their identity and selfhood. This is what I try to argue in that paper, Suman. Does that answer your question, Suman?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Shikha, you were asking about this question of spaces which is kind of close to the jungles and away from the main village, if I've understood you right. Now, there can be various kinds of spaces which could have characteristics of being a camp without physically there being a camp. So these are segregated spaces. The way you are describing, I was thinking of, let us say, the spaces of parayas and pulayas and kind of Dalits, Jatavs, for instance, and leather workers and so on, in the traditional kind of Brahminically organized Indian village. And their tola or their settlement would always be at an extreme periphery of the village, cut off or isolated from the rest of the mainstream village. So this seems to me to be that kind of a space, and I would say that rather than approaching it as a camp, because camp has, as Nasreen has beautifully kind of summed up, as the genealogy of the camp. Camp has a certain kind of history and a certain kind of past, which might be difficult to use in your case, or which might be difficult to operationalize in the case that you're looking at. But it seems to me to be a kind of a dystopic space with its own sort of exclusive characteristics. So I would suggest that you might want to take a look at two kinds of literature. One kind of literature has to do with, let us say, the Inquisition led by Christian fathers and padres during the late Middle Ages, where they went about inquisitorial kind of investigations of what they saw as heretics and heretic kind of practices having to do with black magic, having to do with witchcraft, and they would burn the population of the entire village down to ground. There is a famous book called Montailu by Emmanuel Leroy Ladurie, a historian, and there are similar kind of works on this feminist author Silvia Federici writes at length about there's a book called Caliban and the Witch, which is a fantastic book again on kind of how practices of witchcraft were treated by the mainstream society, and how they were marginalized, and how they're spatially kind of isolated and put into a certain kind of corner, made into some kind of a durable disorder. So those are unfortunately the only markers that I can give you. And from what you have said, I don't necessarily think that using the camp frame would be very productive in your case. Though there are some similarities in the terms of what is taking place in those spaces, and which is the reason why you might want to also take a look at. There's an essay by Foucault, a short essay, but which is full of a lot of interesting insights that can be used as research clues. This essay is called Of Other Spaces, or Heterotopia. It is usually available online. So you could also take a look at that essay from Foucault to, kind of, if it helps you to kind of think conceptually further and create your own kind of paradigm in this case. Alok, Yes, I agree with you that we tend to think a lot about the state and effect of the state, um, which keeps us from looking at the activities of certain population on their own terms. I agree with you with the rider or with the corollary that sometimes it is not really productive to separate the state so much from the society. I mean, it is the social institutions in various ways that constitute the effect of the state, even if they are not formal part of the state. So there is always a host society around the population in question that we are looking at, and the perception of the host society is very interesting. I mean, in my case, when I was looking at the camp, I went around interviewing quite a large number of residents of the area, Mohammadpur, who are not inhabitants of the camp, and their perception of the camp population, and which reflected to me basically the state perspective, which were variations of the state perspective, only they would come in more raw, elemental kind of form. For instance, there would be people who would tell me that don't hang out too much with these Biharis because they're basically animals. The first chance they would get, they are going to stab you in your back. Those kind of utterances, which I thought were very telling in some sense. It's already casting these people in a subhuman sort of a light. But yes, you're right that when we think of what happens in these terms a bit too much, we end up not looking at the activities that are being done by the population in question on their own terms. It is important to see them on their own terms, as it is, I would say, important to see them in the intersection of, their perception of their activities and their terms for their activities and the perception of the outside, the perception of the mainstream society, the perception of the state, and which perceptions then what kind of intersections of these perceptions then can become points of intervention for researchers, can become productive for researchers to dig into, to mine, and to generate new kind of insights. That's not a very comprehensive addressal of your question, but that's what I can tell you at this point of time. Because you see, in my case, I don't think that the Urdu-speaking Muslims, in the case that I'm talking about, they would necessarily agree with what I'm terming as camouflage. They might not agree with this description. This is not maybe how they would like to characterize their activities, for instance. But at the same time, I devised this term trying to keep in mind the sort of intention or the kind of perspective from which this population is forced to take on these kind of activities. So somewhere I am also at one remove from the terms that they would be using for their kind of activities in some sense, which is, of course, very important to take into account. But then there is also room for further kind of refining or theorization. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, Sarika Nair and Ganesh, the two of you. Yes, Sarika?
Hello, sir. My question is regarding your investigation into the spatial history of the place. During this process, did you come across any interesting points in time where the settlement itself saw a positive development in terms of access to public or social infrastructure nearby? And if yes, can you please elaborate on some of them?
Yes, Sarika, I did. I mean, I tried to broadly follow the trajectory of this space, this terrain in some sense from, in fact, even before the Mughal period. And as I said, that it used to be part of the wetlands, marshy lands of Dhaka, full of water bodies and very small plots of land which used to be seasonally cultivated, but the population originally living here seems to be low-caste Hindus who probably left during the partition, and they used to predominantly fish. That used to be their profession. So one can imagine the kind of landscape one is talking about. Now this landscape this became the kind of chosen kind of site for rehabilitating the Urdu-speaking Muslim refugees on the part of the early East Pakistan regime, especially under the military regime of Ayub Khan. This space saw kind of coming up of concrete embankments, because this area was unfit for habitation, primarily because it used to be prone to seasonal flooding, being already filled with water bodies. So there was no question of putting up habitations in this area. So concrete embankments started to be built around the 1960s, around the 1980s. There were a series of concrete embankments that were built. The water bodies were filled up, landfills came up, and it's on this landfill kind of water bodies or marshes that the first set of housing or systematic habitations came up, which were meant for rehabilitating the Urdu-speaking kind of Muslim refugees, and who began by kind of creating, because they prospered, they had fairly impressive looking mansions and houses that came up in the first couple of decades during the 1950s and 60s in this area, and which mansions they had to leave because they were dispossessed of those mansions, as those were declared enemy property during the Bangladesh war. So the rise and fall graph of the Urdu-speaking refugees has to do with the kind of transformations in the spatial history of this area. And I also realized that this identification of marshlands, water bodies, and previously uninhabited kind of spaces, especially wetlands, is a common kind of strategy for rehabilitating refugees across the South Asia. And particularly, we have seen similar kind of processes taking place in Kolkata, for instance. Many of the refugee neighborhoods and refugee habitations have come up in what we now call West Calcutta, or we used to call West Calcutta wetlands, which has undergone similar kind of landfills, right from Salt Lake down to what is taking place even now as new areas come up, even literally called Noyabad and so on. So yes, and there is a kind of long-term geographical fallout of this acquisition of wetlands, of this acquisition of what used to work as water basins, sink basins for cities, large cities like Dhaka and Kolkata and other similar kind of cities, Karachi, very importantly, which is why once these spaces have been filled up with habitations, you have far more of water logging and what is called fluvial flooding now in these cities, of late. So this has a kind of climate implication as well. So yes, I mean, there's a fascinating kind of narrative that is happening there if one wants to look at it, without the narrative of the Bihari Muslims. There's a fascinating history of how these post-colonial sites of urbanization begin to come up. I hope that that answers your question, Sarika.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay. So Ganesh, I think.
Ganesh, am I audible?
Yes. Oh, this is a different person. What is your name?
Vidyasagar. I'm doing my PhD.
Yes, Vidyasagar. Yeah, I know you, Vidyasagar.
Thank you, sir.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I mean, it's really very provoking discussion. I mean, I'm really overwhelmed. So, sir, I have two very, very fundamental question. One is, like, as you mentioned in the discussion, during the course of conducting this study, you have adopted different method, and from anthropology to political science, like sort of in transition. So what sort of ethical dilemma you have come across or you have experienced when you change your method, especially when you are conducting very, very sensitive site or a very vulnerable community? The first one. Second, my question is, I mean, I'm taking a reference from the Didier Fajin, one of the French anthropologist, and he wrote one of the piece, another politics of life is possible. And as you also mentioned about the biopolitics, life as such and life itself. So and the taking this intervention by Professor Nasreen Chowdhory to the idea of of the construction of camp itself. So some of the camp who are already set up by the state for the refugee population, and there are certain kind of camp who evolve with the settlement with the population itself. So in those two different speciality of camp, how do you see this idea of life itself and life as such? So in terms of negotiation of power over life, this idea of Foucault. Yeah.
So, yeah. So, I think you're asking 3 questions here, and quite complex kind of questions. But let me answer the best I can. Okay. I might end up disappointing you, but don't hold it against me.
Yeah.
Because these are tough questions to handle. So, to begin with, I always feel comfortable when I talk about particular empirical cases. Okay. So I have, if we look at, let us say, particular empirical cases of the camps, refugee camps set up by the government. By the way, Professor Nasreen Chowdhory is far more knowledgeable in this regard. She has done far more of these kind of ethnographies of the kind of camps that you're talking about. Including in South India, right, Nasreen? I think including in, yeah. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
It's okay, Rashida. It's okay. I think these are.
No, I would like you to join in the discussion too. So,
okay, sure.
This was drawing you in. Yeah. So the point is, there is a narrative which I have no reason to suspect. Okay, a kind of biopolitical framing in that narrative, in the kind of government constructed sort of camps. What you see, refugee camps. What you see is, very interestingly, among other things, a lot of these camps have certain kind of training programs, vocational training. Okay, so people are taught how to, let us say, work at the sewing machine, or people are taught how to work at, kind of the lead machine. So they are given vocational kind of training, because many of them also happen to be peasants, in terms of their background, and they cannot use their skill as peasants, because they don't have access to cultivable land. That way. So they are then kind of disciplined and remade into workers, okay, into kind of modern industrial workers, or, even if you don't want to use the word industry, one might say, cottage industry kind of workers of one kind or the other. And at the same time, you'd also see that these refugees tend to form clubs. In every kind of settlement, there are 2 or 3 clubs that they build, which carry out a set of activities, including physical kind of training, to sort of giving out signals that they do services to the local community. So blood donation camps they would organize and so on. All of these have to do with a certain kind of molding of life and projecting the picture of a life that is amenable to citizenship, that is appropriate, that is fit for being conferred with citizenship. Okay, so it's a process of becoming the citizen that they voluntarily undertake, as well as, the government kind of does to them. Because many of the administrators of refugee camps and colonies, what later became colonies, there's a common refrain in many of these reports that these people are forgetting how to labor. They're becoming entirely dependent on government doles, and that is a dangerous thing to have. So they have to be kind of trained in one or the other kind of livelihood, which can, give them a source of living, sort of a thing. So that's in the case of the more government sanctioned kind of camps, or what have spontaneously sprung up as camps. But like in West Bengal, in the case of where spontaneously these kind of camps came up, constituted by upper caste Hindus, which is what happened in the early 50s and 60s. Most of the refugees tended to be, at least in Calcutta, those refugees who tended to be from the upper caste, and who were therefore recognized much more by the government in question, by the regimes in question. In their case, you see this kind of a constructing an access to citizenship, and showing the kind of training of a life which is increasingly becoming appropriate for the exercise of citizenship, for enjoying the right to city, sort of a thing. And in contrast to these, when you look at, let us say, the case of Dandakaran or the Morichapi massacre, or the cases of, the case that I described in the case of Bangladesh, you have a different kind of biopolitics, which is close to, theories like Mbembe or others would call necropolitics,
Yeah.
where it's actually the threat to life that becomes far more tangible as a reality, and people are really fighting or struggling just to kind of live, because they are not considered to even be fit for a life of dignity, to have a livelihood, to have an access to various kind of spaces in the host society, because they are like, as one respondent told me, they are like animals. So there is immediately a politics of constructing humans, or those who have the potential to become humans, and those who are kind of subhumans, or those who live like animals. And this last category is obviously by definition excluded from citizenship. And there is a politics through which, they are to be kept at that level, because it is, in some sense, economically and socially also profitable to have a second class citizenship, as we also understand from contemporary kind of, measures by states across the world, many of which maintain a kind of second class citizens by one political sort of ploy or the other. You want to add something to that, Nasreen?
I think somewhere, which is what Vidyasagar was perhaps trying to hint at, if I understand correctly, is there a South Asian dimension to this or not? Because, somewhere we are glossing over the idea when we say refugee camp. Are they indeed refugee camp to begin with? Because there are different nomenclatures of what we say camp and space and colony and settlement. And, all of these terminologies cannot be used interchangeably. So that creates another level of methodological problem itself, because we're trying to fit everything in. So I think perhaps it is important right now to recognize that every experience within South Asia is throwing a kind of a new challenge to speciality. And therefore to the whole idea of what is a habitat. So somewhere the state of exception is something is perpetual. It's not something just temporary. So somewhere when refugees are entering in a zone where they don't have any rights, so their state of exception has already begun. So to suggest that it is only in refugee camp is, I think that's where I think we are creating slightly, theoretical challenges for us. That's been, because when you say subhuman, they are living a life of subhuman. Udbastu, uprooted, they don't have a say. They don't till the state. So if the state is existing, then a government would say that, hey, this is how we basically make you visible. But in a zone of indistinction, where the state is in a suspended state of animation, you are already existing a bare life. You're living a whole idea of bare life. It's being reconstituted. So somewhere I think at two levels challenges that we have not faced. In fact, that's what I was thinking while listening to you, Rashida, which is I really appreciate the way you were probing all the questions, is maybe it's time to talk about the South Asian case much more strongly. And figure out and provide a kind of a criticism and critical appraisal of what really goes on. Because even if in the case of the Geneva camp, yes, historically it exists, but what you're seeing is the everyday resistance is empowering them to continue because they don't have an exit option. So they're there, they have to be there. So their level of subhuman life has been subhuman for a long time. So there is no other way. That's one. And the second is perhaps maybe we don't need to talk about state of exception anymore. Because somewhere there is a concept that we are overusing too much. And which kind of creates another level and we are kind of understating the theoretical positionality of the South Asian case. And I'm saying South Asia over and over again because South Asia over a period of time has captured a large number of refugee population, perhaps even much more than the First World or the global North. So that is something I thought, it can be
Right.
those who are aspiring or
Right.
interested. Like Shikha's question was very interesting. But then I really appreciate the way you brought in the whole idea. Everything is not a camp. Like you cannot, any space which is separate, segregated is not a camp. So, that's something needs to be probably addressed. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Rajni.
Fantastic, yeah. And to answer to your other question, Vidyasagar,
I have a question, so can I?
Ganesh, let me just respond to Vidyasagar's second question, which was about the ethical dilemmas, because I was shifting in terms of methodology and looking at this very vulnerable population. So Vidyasagar, there are two things here. One is, of course, my methodological kind of shifts were arising out of kind of ethical necessities, because I realized that kind of taking the pure formal customary political science approach is not helping me to get beyond a certain level, and I can see so many interesting material at the same time, or issues or questions that are lying at the end of the spectrum, which required me therefore to kind of start borrowing methods from other disciplines, anthropology, geography, some even might say sociology to a certain extent, and topography, those kind of things. So these methodological revisions were in the first place coming out from certain kind of, I would say, ethical claims of the site, ethical claims that were being made by the case study on me to, not mutilate the nuances of the case study by the limitation of my methods. That's one. The second thing is that I also decided not to write about several things, okay? Because of the vulnerable situation of this population. For instance, one of the things about this, there are two things that I practically decided, they were fascinating, but I decided not to write about. One was that being such a space which is kind of ignored by all mainstream parties, apart from to some extent Jamaat-e-Islami, though, I mean, this is a big population we are talking about, and they are incrementally beginning to get voting power, okay? A large number of them, of course, has voting rights, in other names, under other addresses, but who exercise, their votes. However, this space is actually, this and such like spaces is kind of serves as the prime recruiting ground of hardline Islam, of militant Islamic extremists. Okay. Now, and I have a sense of which parts and which sub areas of the larger kind of camp form the hubs of this kind of discourses, recruitments, and speeches of radical kind of preachers being played on a loop throughout the day. But this is something that I was fascinated with, but I did not want to write about it, because I wasn't sure that who is going to use this information to what intent. And for all that I knew, perhaps the state agencies are already very aware of, if there are competent agencies, they are already aware of this kind of aspects. The other issue that I did not write about is that there is, because partly of intellectual difficulty, but also certain ethical problems, is that the population living in these areas, in these camps, in this space, they have a different kind of cosmopolitan imagination. They have an imagination of the world, okay? But this world is not made up necessarily of the primacy of New York, London, Paris, such like cities. It's mediated by, the geography of Middle East, the Iraqi civilization, the Ottoman Empire, so on and so forth. So there is a linkage and a kind of cultural sort of connection of belonging to a very, very different sort of a tradition, a kind of cosmopolitan tradition, but a very different kind of tradition, which I found again very fascinating. But I did not know, I still don't know enough about Ottoman Empire and what the fragmentation of Ottoman Empire led to, apart from the fact that and the fact that this might actually alienate them. Writing about this could have alienated them more from the local Bangla speaking population who share the more mainstream cosmopolitan imagination. Okay, and I did not want to kind of reveal this parallel other kind of imagination that this population have. So therefore, when they manage to save up money, if it's not for seeking livelihood, these are the spaces where they would like to go, where they would like to visit. These are the places where from where they would even sometimes borrow their everyday habits. I'll give you one example which is becoming increasingly popular in Bangladesh. They used to say Khuda, Khuda or Khuda in much of their, like we say Bhagwan and so on, or Hey Ram, so on. Now this over the last 10-15 years have changed, and changed in fact almost across the lower classes and middle classes into Allah. And there's a lot of kind of Arabic inflections that are coming in terms of speech, in terms of customary gestures and so on and so forth, which is happening, which is a kind of engagement with this particular geography and culture. So this is again something that I could not write about because I wasn't ethically comfortable with writing about this. So that's by way of answering you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. Yes, Ganesh.
We are running late, so can I ask? So there are other hands actually.
Yeah.
Kind of, yeah, a kind of doubt, like when we are saying, then when you are separating from kind of anthropologist to grasp some kind of political content, that's the political material you are using. And also recently that Vidyasagar asked this question, this disciplinary boundary, actually I'm a bit doubt. So like when we study particular community or anything, we can also see some kind of power relations, hierarchy, which is a kind of political terminology, we can say. So how do you actually segregate this kind of confusion and confusing category and word, actually term, that we can find in the another setup and in this more political kind of setup and the site, actually?
Can you give me an example of what you are saying?
Like suppose you are doing this study on the refugee camp. Of course, this is directly connect to the idea of political, that is state and the statelessness and citizens, non-citizens and all this. So when and another set, when we are studying about particular culture, like Clifford Grease kind of anthropologists are doing, like they have done. So when we are also doing there, we are not saying it is a kind of political anthropologist nowadays, actually people are using, but we can find some bits of some kind of political content, like between the community, within the community there are also power relations we can find, and also hierarchy, which is also a kind of political category if we look in the microscopic.
Sure.
So that's kind of confusion, actually, I guess.
Sure. No, I understand now your question. See, the thing is, the way or the extent to which I looked at this issue with regard to the Bihari Muslims is that there would have been probably the need to kind of look at their internal differences in terms of the kind of denominations they have within. This basically is a Sunni population, but it also celebrates Shia occasions with major fanfare. And I am not informed well enough about the hierarchies or denominations within the Sunnis to kind of explore that dimension. But what I did is what I could operationalize, what I knew is to kind of look at the internal stratification in terms of at least their class, in terms of at least their class location. So among these refugees, I talk about families which are pretty well off, which are very well to do, which have access to business, which have kind of a higher lifestyle, a better kind of lifestyle, more resources, better connected, and families which are at the bottom of the rung. So that kind of stratification I have looked at, the kind of internal sort of differences, like the difference between, let us say, a lower class and a lower middle class and a lower upper class. So even if we walk out to Kusumpur Pahari, for instance, we can see that there are some of these shacks or hovels are 3-storied, and some of these shacks or hovels are 1-storied. We can see that the rooms or hovels that are situated on the main road, we know that they are let out for a higher amount of rent, or the more powerful, the more well-off kind of members of the population actually live in those rooms which are adjoining the street. And the more marginal you are in that population, the more you get pushed back into the sort of away from the street, away from the main road kind of direction. So those are the kind of hierarchies that I managed to kind of look into. But as I told you, that, and this also has to do with the question of gender, that being identified as a Hindu from West Bengal and being directly implicated, having probably stakes in the partition, I could not become privy to the extremely sensitive internal kind of nuances among this population. There was only so much that they would share with me, and that too they managed to share with me over 10 years. Okay, the kind of questions you are raising and the kind of population we are looking at, which is very defensive, remember, which is very defensive and which shuts down. It does not like to be quizzed or questioned about things. It's not, kind of open to giving out information. It makes it very difficult to operationalize the kind of questions that you are asking. But I did that with regard to broadly the question of class and social status. Okay, Ganesh, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So actually we are running late. I mean, we are going to have time 6 p.m. So
Yeah,
the
it's almost 6.
actually raised 2 people, sir, their hand actually. So I don't think.
I'm happy to take them in. If they quickly ask their questions, and if these are brief questions, yeah.
Okay.
So please go.
Anand Raj, would you like to ask? And
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for this discussion and the opportunity. My question is to Professor Dasgupta is that you were just talking about the spatial identity of the Biharis. My question is that did you see or just find the stigma related with the spatial identity, like a spoiled identity? What government argues that did you just incorporated this thing in your study? If yes, then how did you map it? My question is that. Thank you.
I did not understand your question. What exactly are you asking?
My question is that, sir, you were just talking about the condition and the Biharis in the Bangladesh and the refugee camp. And my question is that that's related to a spatial identity related to the particular geographical, and the identity related to the how identity related with the stigma. My whole question rounds about the stigma. It means that they are stigmatized. Did you just put up the question of stigma with your work or not? If yes, then how did you map the stigma related to a special identity?
Okay, so there are 2 things here, Anand. One is the stigma related to them, which I have already talked about in terms of, for instance, them being described in subhuman terms or in terms which are animal-like, and there are more detail about this kind of treatment of this population by the host population in the actual paper. So that's how I looked at stigmatization in terms of how the host society kind of humiliates, this population at each and every turn. But this humiliation is not based on a region-based identity. Although they are referred to as Biharis, the identity is based on the fact that they come from a population who are Urdu speaking, who are Urdu speakers. So it goes back to a question of language and difference of language and their sentiments about being Bangla speakers and their pride, the national pride around Bengali language and the language movement. So that is what is at odds, that, who is a Bangla speaker and who is a Urdu speaker, and how the Urdu speakers fought against the Bangla speakers, and the Bangla speakers have now kind of got their own nation, and which will treat the Urdu speakers like enemies of the nation in some sense. So the stigmatization is to that level. So, the Urdu speakers who are also as a shorthand referred to as Biharis, though not all of them are Biharis. So geographically, they are quite diverse. I mean, they're places of origin in that sense. Um, all of them are, kind of seen as these animal-like, subhuman, uncivilized, only fit for, hard labor work, kind of professional coolies and so on and so forth, while they are actually very skilled. Many of them are makers of Banarasi, actually. They are Ansaris in that sense. They are looked at as, kind of traitors of the nation, similar to what, probably in our context would be seen as tukre gang. So that's the kind of stigma that I sort of explored, you might want to say.
Yes, I got it. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Yes.
Okay. So, Tanjam, would you like to ask, or is it?
Yes, sir. Sir, I'm Tanjam Pro Kumar Singh, PhD
Okay.
student in the Department of Political Science, Delhi University, sir.
Okay.
Sir, my question is, you have also using the term camouflage.
Yeah.
Sir, my question is a bit apart from your topic. My question is related to Manipur issue, sir. Sir, in Manipur, we have the term camouflage and victim or the taboo, use the Bihari taboo, because in the Manipur context, the term Mizo is identity or the camouflage, they are getting scheduled tribe certificate and they are getting the higher pedestrian bureaucrat or in the academic line, sir.
Mhm.
And I feel as a student, I don't feel any shy or taboo by saying that I am a Mizo or I am a Mizo tribe, because they have the advantage. And in course of time, they also, in the academic life, they also don't believe the modern state boundary. The Manipur, the international boundary, they don't believe. They used to grow, they used to that went up and down in the border, and they have cultural linkages, language, culture, and identity. And they are starting challenging the environmental security and the land security. And now they are starting challenging the sovereignty and tranquility of the nation. Then how can we look as a student in the forced migration, especially from the Myanmar side, sir?
Unfortunately, I'm not competent enough to answer this question because I don't really know the history and the facts related to the context that you are talking about. So I wouldn't want to kind of give you a very speculative answer on this. I used the idea of camouflage in this particular kind of context and paper that I did. Maybe Nasreen, would you want to kind of respond to that question? Because I'm certainly not adequately informed to handle this question.
No, that's okay. We can, I think somewhere the idea is, if I understand Priya, you're trying to figure out the question of who.
Because in Manipur, we don't have the government recognized detention center or refugee camp. Most of the civil society organizations, they are trying to put up the concept of that detention camp or refugee camp. But still, the government of India or the government of Manipur don't recognize this concept or this area. So most of the people are living, it's a that open secret. The people of the Mizo tribe also, they are accepting the number may be variable. The people migrating from the Myanmar are still has been continued in the state of Manipur and the Mizoram also. So they are making a big picture of the Mizo identity formation and challenging the concept of state answer. So how can we see most refugee studies, they are looking a refugee or as a victim person or victim member. But what I'm trying to see in Manipur context is they are not the victim, they are the winner. So how can we look?
Priya, there is exactly what is the ethical question that I think somebody asked earlier. Because you're already presuming that whichever the other is either a empowered position or is a victim. We don't know. It's for the research that we are doing will facilitate us. So if perhaps as an insider knowledge, that's probably what we think. So it's about, what Myron Wiener talks about, how the demography is changing as a result of some kind of migration that has happened. So it's a a larger question for perhaps another day. But I think perhaps you're getting confused with two categories. One is son of soil, okay, and who constitutes a refugee and who is an insider outsider. So maybe that's where the dilemma is. And you're trying to find an answer to a question that you already think you have an answer.
I would certainly need a longer conversation with you, Tanjam, maybe face to face, understand what you're saying and respond to it. I don't want to be, careless and casual and, just say something off the cuff without getting a sense of.
Thank you, ma'am.
And just, kind of one last couple of sentences I wanted to respond to Nasreen, one of the points that Nasreen had raised about this figuring out what is particular to South Asia and whether that requires a kind of reliance on, let's say, theorists like Agamben and so on. So, and it's a question that I thought resonated with a couple of other questions as well in the question answer session. So let me say, Nasreen, that I am trying to do a bit of both, which is I am trying to firstly figure out what are the kind of aspects here that are peculiar and that are kind of singular to the case studies that we get in South Asia, what could be generalized at least in the South Asian kind of context. But at the same time, and because somebody else took the name of Didier Fassi, I quite a bit, and even in this paper I did. So there are at the same time certain kind of parallels, if I may say, parallels contexts in some French context, in some cases I as I can see now, Eastern Mediterranean contexts, Turkey, Greece, and so on, which are not entirely different from what that what he's focusing on, or what some others are kind of talking about, like Paris Chronakis, or what they are talking about. These are not exception. These lie outside the mainframe of that discourse. So one might, I'm tempted to say that we find pockets of global south within global north, which has been not talked about the global north. So my interest lies in what can I kind of, let us say, dig up, mine from the global south, so that we can speak back, talk back to the kind of experiences of global north, which may help to reveal some of the dimensions in global northern experience which have remained, concealed so far, which have gone uninterrogated so far. And that's the reason that I, kind of engage with Agamben, trying to do here, at least for the sake of this paper, something which will be more by the nature of a conversation rather than a one-way sort of a borrowing of a concept and then kind of applying it and saying that, look, it also works here. Because it partly works and then there is a part where it does not, where, I can, come in.
No, I just want to quickly say something, because see, whole point is when we are dealing with Agamben, that's a good starting point. But then we have a conversation, we are debunking it, but we are not taking it another level up. So Fasten talks about hospitality. The whole idea about, so South Asian context has been having a very different kind of policy. So let's say, how can we talk about a community who's disempowered when you presume that they're not disempowered, because you see them, you are kind of, you're coexisting in a scenario where there is an us and them, but are they then refugees? So the question becomes, who is a refugee? Are they indeed this disempowered body, or is it something else that is going on? And hence you have another kind of narrative that emerges from there, as an insider-outsider dilemma that really, and the human security angle, and all of that emerges. So Rajita, my whole emphasis was that perhaps it's time that, Agamben himself also would not talk about exception, because exception emerge in a particular context. And it has kind of, in a state of exception, is only a temporarily, there's a temporality to it. And where there is a World War II scenario and Schmidt and others, we know that, right? That discussion is there. So in the South Asian context, if they are indeed not passive bodies, but they are proactive, as you're saying, right? They are sites of resistance. So the question is, are we mapping the resistance? In your case, I would be kind of, for maybe the next work could be on how the stories of resistance are emerging within the state of exception. That we are not hearing much from our own work. Like, it's there intermittently, but we kind of fall short. And hence, unfortunately, in my opinion, there's no conversation happening with the global north. Rather, it is kind of something we are critiquing, and we're kind of letting it, kind of it stays there. Yeah.
No, I understand that. The thing is, for me, state of exception remains important in the sense that it has a particular kind of historical origin and a certain historical context. But what it manages to do is to present us a theoretical model that can be decontextualized and that can be used to talk about, let us say, a vulnerable population who are always facing the threat of death, who are always under the shadow of death, whose much of every day goes in how am I going to kind of eke out a living, eke out a life, and how am I going to dodge the threat of being lynched to death. And I think there, in that sort of a move, of the exercise of sovereign power by the state on vulnerable population, there is a scope for generalization. There is a scope for generality, and there is a scope of mining new material that can tell us, unlike Agamben, as you were saying, what is it that people are doing. And there, since you brought this up, and it remains like a question in my work as well, I am getting interested in what lies before resistance, somewhere. What is the condition of resistance? One precondition of resistance is I have to keep living. I have to survive. And how do these people first of all ensure that, the survival aspect of it, which I'm talking about as politics of persistence? Say we are caught up in a situation where there is a very, very low ceiling and there are certain things we know we cannot say, we cannot do. We cannot freely come out with, either as a criticism or as a statement. Okay? And it is living under a permanent kind of cloud, or a kind of cloud which is now permanent for some time, sort of under the shadow of authoritarian regimes, globally spread and so on and so forth. So what are we witnessing there? Are we witnessing something that because the moment we say resistance, it gives us a lot of optimism. It gives us a sense of reversal of the situation. What of the situations which are not showing signs of getting better, but signs of getting even more deeply entrenched? So that's why I have chosen this, kind of more modest kind of layer of persistence to look at that. Yeah.
Thank you.
But thank you so much for the engagement, Nasreen, as always. Fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you, Ganesh.
Thank Ganesh for asking you to.
So, thank you for your time, and it's like already we have running time, and also feel like we are in class actually. Because I have experienced both of your class. And thank you for your time, and thank you for the participants. So
not at all.
We have announcement there. Tomorrow we will have another book discussion series of Stroud's book, The Evolution of Pragmatism, Ambedkar's biography, that has been written by Scott Stroud. So tomorrow in the same time, 4 p.m. So thank you again, both of you, and thank you so much for enlightening us.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye-bye.